I am not a psychologist, although I would say if you want to learn about the harmful mind, pursuing a career in politics is one very good way to do that, as I tried to do for a while. But I am extremely passionate about how we take the insights of psychology, and in particular compassion science, and apply it not only to clearly benefit individual lives, but actually to try and transform societies, institutions, cultures and governments. And that is why I was completely absorbed, transfixed, managed to read through extremely quickly despite it being over 1,000 pages long, I, You, We, Them, by our guest today, the author and activist Dan Gretton. It is really difficult to summarise in a short introduction the depth and breadth of a book that I think took Dan 10 years to work on. I mean, a lifetime of work and thinking. But in essence, Dan is asking the fairly critical question of why do people do bad things, or why do, more specifically, societies allow bad things to happen? Why do we live with institutions that do bad things without throwing up our arms in revolt? Why do ostensibly good people, who are good family people, good friends, go out to work for institutions that directly or indirectly cause misery to millions? And that is the topic that we are going to explore. And to be honest, I couldn't think of a more prescient topic given the struggles that our society is having with the shadow of neoliberalism, which pulls people apart, pulls us in different directions, puts pressure on many people to forget many of their basic ethics and morals. How do we come back to that, and how do we understand how we are going to create the change in society that we want? Now, I'm not actually tasked with having to delve into those impossible questions. That's going to be John's job. And I asked John earlier how he would like me to introduce him, and he said simply refer to him as Grandad John. And apparently everyone else will understand what that means. So I hope I've not been set up to fail. John is going to largely conduct the interview with Dan, and then if there is time at the end, I will try and take some questions from the audience, but I know that Dan is around for the remainder of today, so, and I'm going to say this now on Dan's behalf, probably happy to have further conversations, as this is very much a conversation starter. So, over to John.
Okay. Is that working? Yes. Okay. I'm going to rock the mic like a vandal now. If anybody can tell me what that's from, you get a bonus pint later. There's your pint. I don't know how to follow that, actually. It's such an eloquent kind of introduction. It's a big book. It's a book that I've read twice now. I think I confessed to you, Dan, that I read it like an academic text originally. So I was just looking for parts of it that kind of stimulated my kind of professional interests. And then read it again and realised that it's much more than an academic text, that it's your life story. It's your life story that I found was eloquently and elegantly intertwined with some startling facts, some startling kind of historical facts. There's not many books I've read that I know aren't fiction, where you reach moments where you just have to put the book down and think, I'm not going to swear, but something that would have the letters WTF. And just astonished by some of the things that you talk about in the book, but the utter paradox of some of the things people have done, yet I'm not sure what to call it, but the celebration that those same individuals had within their societies and within their cultures. So it was an emotional roller coaster, and I have to say, from personal perspective of reading it, was made all the better because of the way you intertwined your own life story throughout. So I'm going to try and keep my talking to a minimum. I'm not doing a very good job of that at the moment because I said this bit would be a few seconds, and that clock's already telling me it's been more than that. How did it come about? What's the evolution? What's the genesis of this creation?
Thank you both Matt and John, for those introductions. And also thank you very much to Paul for inviting me. Before I left home, the last book I saw in my house, and it was sort of begging me to bring it with me. It's a book that came out in the 1990s that some of you may know, called We've Had 100 Years of Psychotherapy and the World is Getting Worse. And that came out, I think, in 91, 92. James Hillman, the great American writer and a colleague. And I was thinking about that, saying, well, we've had 130 years of psychotherapy now and the world is getting worse. And I suppose my feeling of, I've always thought of myself as a writer and an activist, and those are two very much together. And I just think the world is in an extraordinarily grim phase at the moment. And of course, I hesitate then to add more grimness to the world. But there is a paradoxical hope which comes from identifying particular patterns and particular issues. I think there is a real hope. And I hope we get to the hope by the end of this. It shouldn't just be relentless. But yes, I'm going to start just with, to give you a texture, I'm going to start just with a very short reading from the very beginning of the book. It was roughly 20 years of thought and about 10 years of writing that went into this. And this takes me back to the moment I began to try and write down after 30 years. I'm sitting in the window of a small cottage that feels more like the cabin of a boat. In front of me, a January sea, 2 upturned dinghies, a flock of birds I cannot identify, flitting in crazed gusts, a red and white plastic bag cartwheeling just too fast for me to read the writing on it. And the paradox that despite the buffeting of the winds on all sides, I feel a sense of stillness for the first time in months. I always knew that the writing could only start here, and probably only at this time of year, the emptiness of January. Looking to the east, beyond the grey strip of the North Sea, which used to be known as the German Ocean. And in that sea, there still exist, in minuscule particles, the pulverized stones of Spandau Prison dumped into these waters after its last prisoner died. All this time, trying to understand violence and its relationship to those who work at their desks, at their computers. Them, us, you, me. I reflect on the last decade of journeying and attempting to grapple with this subject. 10 years of visiting archives, walking through sites of extermination, reading interviews with survivors and perpetrators, and thousands of pages of testimony. And yet, as I begin to write, my screen is frozen, a white page. I'm rapidly trying to scan the multiplicity of images and sounds which inhabit me, searching for a way to begin. These understandings and experiences which have haunted me for years. Voices, places, walks and faces jostle for attention as I write these words on a bitingly cold January day. It's hard to recognize, but it was here. They burned people here. Zislav in his hut at Chełmno in Poland, fighting his personal battle against forgetting with the aid of handwritten pages that few will ever read. The minutes of the Wannsee conference, the miraculous single surviving document, 1 copy out of 30, the lawyers who planned the Holocaust, the killing of Ken Saro-Wiwa, the plumes of fire and smoke that have choked a land for over 40 years, and we have all let this continue. Maria Saro-Wiwa singing the Agony anthem in a broken voice to a small crowd gathered by the Thames to remember her husband who died trying to save his land and people from being destroyed by oil. Saura's corporate communications director protesting from her comfortable office. But we have nothing to do with that company now. Talking to Gita Sereni about Albert Speer and that single line, I loved machines more than people. Walking from Goethe's house out of Weimar, over the Ettersberg, into the beech forest, Buchenwald. You can walk it in an hour and a half. And Walter Stier, the railway official who timetabled the trains to Treblinka, insists again, I just sat at my desk. I was just a desk man. Our fingers freezing in the snows of Monowitz, trying to read Levy's words in the dying light. All of these dancing in my head, defying me to begin without them.
Potent stuff. It's potent stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this started it all?
Well, the very beginning was, in a way, there were three moments I would call light bulb moments. And the three moments happened over about 10 years. The first moment was actually the image you've got up there. The first moment was, I was 22 years old, and for 2 days, I was sitting in a cinema in London, watching the most extraordinary film that's ever been made about the Holocaust, Shoah by Claude Lanzmann. And there was one part of that film, it's a staggering film. It's mainly interviews with perpetrators and survivors and the witnesses. But there was one part of that film that I could not get out of my head, and it's shown in that document there you can see on the screen, Reich Secret Business. And this was the kind of language that it was a disembodied memorandum, like a business memorandum, written from one businessman, it seemed, to another. And this is what it said, and you couldn't work out what was going on at the beginning. And maybe you can tell me what's going on, but it took me, I couldn't work it out. Modifications to special vehicles now in service at Kulmhof, Kelmno, and for those now being built. Since December 1941, 97,000 have been processed by the 3 vehicles in service with no major incidents. However, in the light of observations, the following technical changes are needed. The normal load is 9 per square metre. In Sauer vehicles, which are very spacious, maximum use of space is impossible. Not because of any overload, but because loading to full capacity would affect the vehicle's stability. A reduction in capacity seems necessary. It must be reduced by 1 metre instead of attempting to solve the problem, as before, by reducing the number of items loaded. That also extends the operating time, as the void must be filled with carbon monoxide. This is one official bureaucrat writing to another. And of course it was about how these vehicles could be turned into more efficient mobile gas chambers.
And the items? The items,
they're never called people, they're called items or merchandise or the load. They're never referred to as people. That went into me. I didn't know what to do with that knowledge, like sometimes we don't do. We just have to sort of put it somewhere in our brains and we think, well, maybe we'll come back to that. Yeah. It was too disturbing, far too disturbing. A few years later on, I was working with my company that I set up called Platform. We were working on the staggering levels of human rights abuses and environmental abuses that oil companies perpetrate. This is in the 1990s. We set up a project 30 years ago called 90% Crude. We were asking people to imagine reducing their carbon emissions by 90%. This is in 1995 we started that project. People laughed at us then and said we're impossibilists. People said, it's ridiculous, you never get people to it's upset. We lost our Arts Council funding. and I'm just fascinated that, what seems mad 25 years later becomes becomes what governments around the world are doing. But, one of the things we did in the 1990s was, if we can have this image it's the image of Ken Saro-Wiwa here. Yeah. We found out what was going on in Nigeria, and we could not believe it. And this is a generational thing, I'm quite aware. This was in the early 90s. This is 92, 93. Ken Saro-Wiwa, whose name probably is not as well known now as it should be, he was a phenomenal writer, a wonderful writer, and an activist. And he set up probably one of the greatest movements, peaceful movements of Gandhian non-violent direct action that there's been in the last 50 years. It was staggering to try and stop the pollution, which was worse than any pollution I have ever seen in the world. Gas flaring, going through villages, hundreds of people being killed, explosions from gas leaks, gas pipe leaks. And Shell, a partly British company, of course, Shell, part British-Dutch, and Chevron, the American company, were also heavily involved. But the Shell part was appalling to us, and we got really involved in this campaign. And Ken Saro-Wiwa, at the height, managed to get 300,000 Ogoni in January 1994 out, and they stopped the production of oil throughout the Niger Delta. And this is a country where 95% of the income came from oil.
Yeah.
So you can imagine the reaction of the Nigerian government and Shell. This man had to be stopped, and they would do anything to stop him. And what they did, as some of you may remember, shamefully, with the collaboration of Shell, effectively, they framed him and 8 of his colleagues. There was a kangaroo court. It was a trial which every single international observer said was a farce. And on the 10th of November, 1995, this extraordinary man and 8 of his colleagues were executed in Port Harcourt. And that was a total watershed moment for me, because we knew the family by this stage. We knew Maria, his wife. We knew the children. And nobody thought it would happen. Nelson Mandela didn't think it would happen. He called it the biggest mistake of his life. He tried to do quiet diplomacy. You can't do that with a military dictator and with oil companies. You can't do that. But the thing that I thought about then, I thought about how would you continue to go to work the next day? I was living in London then, and this building is very prominent. Some of you will have seen this, the Shell Centre in Waterloo. It's now flats. I thought, and that's Mark Moody Stewart, who was the chairman at the time of the Anglo part of Shell. By the way, I should tell you, a journalist sent me some years later the minutes of a meeting the day before that happened in that building. All the senior people at Shell talking about whether they would or not send a letter requesting clemency the day before. They could have done anything to stop that trial for a year before, and they decided not to. So the blood is on the hands of all of those people who worked at the senior levels of that company. And shockingly, only a single person resigned. One person resigned in Holland after that. One person from that company resigned. And I thought, what kind of headspace, what moral gymnastics would you have to do to get up to go to work in that building the next day? Business as normal. What would you have to do to your head? How would you have to, what kind of process of psychology where you could continue to draw your salary knowing what your company had been responsible for? And that was the second moment. That was the second light bulb, which connected to that memorandum being written. And I thought, and by this stage I was beginning to think there could be a sort of project here. And then the third light bulb moment, if we can get to it, is this remarkable book by Gita Sareni, who has written probably the greatest ever work about what we could call perpetrator psychology. She wrote an incredible book. Well, she wrote a book about Mary Bell that was also very interesting, but the book about Stangl, the commandant of Treblinka, is an absolutely essential read to anybody who's interested in the disassociation that goes on in the minds of really significant perpetrators.
And this was an extermination camp.
That's an extermination camp. And she talks to Stangl in prison. She talks to him so extraordinarily that after 3 or 4 weeks of talking to him in his Dusseldorf prison cell, and then he finally, for the first time, he voices his responsibility. He died immediately after those interviews. But the book that blew my mind was the book she did about Albert Speer, who is one of the most problematic figures in history. He was Hitler's architect originally and then became the Minister for War Production and a brilliant armaments minister. And because of his skills, many historians think the war went on an additional year. So imagine we're talking about the lives of perhaps 20 million people. So huge level of responsibility. But unlike the other Nazi senior people, he was an extremely cultured man, intellectual, family, 5 children, very civilized man. He never hurt anybody himself. He stayed in Berlin at the office.
A bit
He
like the
stayed
Shell
working in Berlin.
executives.
Well, exactly. And this was the moment. I still remember where I was. I was at my mum's house, and this was the moment This was where the three light bulb moments came together. And it was this is what I read in Gita Serene's book when she's talking to Speer. Hitler required us not only to compartmentalize our actions, but also our thinking. He insisted that each man should only think about his task and not be concerned with that of his neighbor. And this was then formalized in an order called General Order Number 1, forbidding, which states every man need only know what is going on in his own domain. And then Speer talks about the way this authoritarianism, it got people to start thinking within isolated chambers. And I'm very, very interested in it. And this is what he says. To show how compartmentalized he was, just listen to this. This is him writing in 1944. He says, I felt myself to be Hitler's architect. Political events did not concern me. I felt there was no need for me to take any political positions at all. And he then says he was still hanging on to this illusion in 1944, and he wrote to Hitler, the task I have to fulfill is an unpolitical one. I have felt at ease in my work only as so long as my person and my work were evaluated solely by the standards of practical accomplishments. It seems to me now I was trying to compartmentalize my mind, and I suddenly thought at that moment, compartmentalization is the key to all of it. It links the memorandum, the SARA, it links all the shell directors going in the next day, all the people continuing to work. There must be a process of psychological compartmentalization. And I know it's not an academic term, that's just my term for it. So those were the three moments. And at the end of it, you start seeing that compartmentalization everywhere. You start seeing it in our world now. I mean, listen to this. This is about how Putin works in Russia. This is from a Tim Hewell Radio 4 program last year. Putin makes sure that those he consults can't compare notes. It's the very antithesis of joined-up government. When the president has an idea, he discusses it with his closest advisors, but he divides them up very strictly by specialisms. You're responsible for the economy, so don't interfere with this. Your security, so stay out of that. You're the ideology person, keep to your brief. So his Security Council is like a boat divided up into bulkheads. And I also then have started to research, if we can go on to the next slide, this now gets more to the area of many of you in this room. The two psychologists who advised the Bush administration on how to torture people in Guantanamo Bay. And this gentleman here is called James Mitchell, and his colleague was Bruce Jessen. And two of them actually advised how you can, and here are the lawyers as well. There's a whole chapter in my book on the lawyers of Washington, Jay Bybee, and this other man who, sorry, his name, Bybee and, bear with me, sorry. And these two men wrote memos to each other which were staggering. If you think this might be a historical situation, believe me, it's not. I mean, these two people wrote the kind of memoranda to each other. Stephen Bradbury, sorry. Yeah, Jay Bybee is the one on the left, Stephen Bradbury on the right. And they, to read these memoranda about waterboarding, essentially coming up with waterboarding and how it just could not be termed torture if you tweak it in this way. I mean, it's so disgusting. And the fact that they were advised by psychologists is also completely disgusting. And again, utter compartmentalization going on there. Total, I mean, to a job like a psychologist, ending up doing that is a staggering perversion of the role. And I think of it again in how drone warfare is carried out. If you think about people in Nevada, in a little shed in Nevada, killing people 8,000 miles away, operating, and then driving back and having supper with their families. And they've been working from a kind of office environment in Nevada. while that's happening. So all of these, what links all of these is none of these are about direct killing. None of these are about getting blood on your hands, and that is our world today. That is our world in terms of governments, in terms of the power that corporations have, pharmaceutical companies, whether you're talking about arms companies. They never kill the people in those companies. Of course, they never have blood on their hands. And of course, if they get prosecuted, they have the best lawyers money can buy. And how we even begin to try and find justice in a world like that is staggering. So I began to conceive of this really massive project. I knew it would take the rest of my life on looking at what I call desk killers, the desk killers. And Eichmann, of course, is the archetypal example, the bureaucrat who organized organized the Holocaust from his desk in Berlin. The term Schreibtischtäter, which is the German, that was used at the trial of Eichmann. And Hannah Arendt, the great philosopher, she was one of the first people to use this term. Gideon Hausner, the prosecutor, used a similar term at the trial, and then Hannah Arendt used it later on in a book she wrote the preface to in 1966. But this then has just inhabited me, really, for the last 20, 25 years. And I then began to conceive a project which would be I knew the research would take about 10 years. It took about 11 in the end. I had a funding from an amazing foundation in America, the Lannan Foundation, who gave me a significant amount of funding so I could go to Poland, I could go to Bosnia. I did series of lecture performances in London. Each of those performances I brought together people from high levels of corporations coming in their own time on a Saturday, and there were also psychologists at all of those events, and then there was discussion afterwards. We had a range of people in those very small-scale lecture performances. Those took about 4 to 5 years to develop the work. And so eventually it got to the stage where there was this vast amount of material, and a very great most wonderful writer, and some of you will know, perhaps the greatest political writer of the last 50 years, John Berger, who became a very close friend in the last 10 or 15 years of his life. And he said, Dan, you've got to turn this into a book, or turn it into 2 books. You've got to get the desk killers into mainstream public discourse. And so I did spend then about 10 years writing the book. And so I'd now like, in the time we've got left, I'd really like to move on to really how we look at what you could be called perpetrators, and the issue of whether we understand how the balance we strike between understanding and condemning.
And I think there's something really significant in what you've just been saying, Dan, because when you think about perpetrators, I mean, certainly for those of us who work in forensic settings, that conjures up the people who are living behind the bars and the fences of the places that we've tended to work into. Yet what you've just been describing are psychologists. Yeah. Psychologists who were constructing torture techniques that they referred to as enhanced interrogation techniques. Exactly. So their use of language to distance themselves or to compartmentalise, as you put it. And then lawyers debating the definition of torture to actually say waterboarding, which is what the psychologists were advising, doesn't constitute torture because somebody's life isn't actually at risk. So this idea of perpetrators with this group of people is probably quite different to the notion of perpetrators that we're used to.
No, absolutely. So, that's a significant difference. You're right. You're right to draw that out. But what is in common of those is I only met Gita Sereny once. We had the most extraordinary conversation, and I'd come across a quotation by the German writer Bernhard Schlink, who some of you may know from his book The Reader. And I read this quote to Gita Sereny, and she said that is exactly what she's trying to do for the whole of her working life. Because what Schlink writes in The Reader, and this relates probably to so much of the work that so many of you are doing, which, by the way, talking to John and Carenza yesterday and hearing the presentations today, I am totally blown away by what many of you in this room do and the environments you do it in. I think it's absolutely staggering work. And I'm not sure I could begin to do that. But this is the quotation.
You have in
well,
many ways.
maybe in one way. And, yeah. In Bernard Schlink's book, The Reader, the protagonist finds out something terrifying about this older woman he's had a relationship with. He's a teenager, and she's older than him. And he finds out that she was involved in the most barbaric massacre. And the narrator, who's known him in a very tender way, in a very beautiful way, who's known Hannah in a totally other way, can't believe this, what she's been responsible for. And he then writes this: I wanted simultaneously to understand Hannah's crime and to condemn it. But it was too terrible for that. When I tried to understand it, I had the feeling I was failing to condemn it, as it must be condemned. When I condemned it, as it must be condemned, there was no room for understanding. I wanted to pose myself both tasks, understanding and condemnation, but it was impossible to do both. Now, when I read that to Gita Sereni, she said, but Dan, it is possible to do both. And that's how she's always been with the subjects she spoke to, Stangl or Albert Speer or Mary Bell. And the more I read her, the more I understood that she does something admirable, which I think probably many of you in this room do as well, which is, I ended up calling it the process of serenization, using her name. And this is what I wrote, and I'll just read this very short piece from the early part of the book. Sereni spends weeks, months, sometimes years with her subjects. She goes through what happened, how it happened, why it happened. She's both extraordinarily patient and mercilessly relentless. She is more interested in understanding than judgment. She rarely becomes angry. She leaves judgment up to her subject when she senses the time is right for him or her to face their responsibility. And of course, we as readers can ultimately judge as well, but only when we've come through a process of what I now think of as serenization, the understanding that's achieved through lengthy and empathetic exploration of a person when a subject stops being an object of condemnation and becomes a human being again. And I think that that idea of, on that line that we all have to walk through, of judging, condemning, or understanding, I would always, and this is hard to say as an activist, because in activism you're surrounded by people who can be extraordinarily judgmental and two-dimensional sometimes, but I think, like Sereni, I'm about 75-80% down that line towards understanding rather than condemning, because I think that opens doors, and I think condemning closes doors. And I really think, and this relates, John, very much to something you wrote in a paper you sent to me when you talked about changing the language used. It's very important, changing the labeling of people as sex offenders or murderers, i.e. reducing the entire complexity of their humanity to single actions or single crimes, and the move from what is wrong with you to what has happened to you. And Carenza also referred to this earlier. And I think the what has happened to you as a question, it relates to curiosity. And curiosity to me has become a word just as important as love. It's almost indistinguishable from love. And the curiosity, how rarely that is, how rarely we have that, I think, fully in our societies. And when Gillian talked just before lunch, I was extraordinarily moved by the young woman who broke down and walked away because she had been thinking about her. And that was the first time she felt that somebody had been thinking about her. And if we think about the epidemic of loneliness we have in our societies today, just think about that phrase that you hear all the time. Friends, how are you? How are you? And then think about what it would mean if people started to say, how are you? Or maybe sometimes people do say that to you. And when it happens, it's very moving. Because how are you, really? I mean, curiosity could save more lives than any medication.
Yeah, we were talking.
How could we get curiosity, prescribed?
Curiosity kills the crap.
Curiosity kills the crap. And it also, that whole thing also comes back to, I mean, I'm a very, very lapsed Catholic now, but I was brought up a Catholic, and we were always told that St. Augustine line, you hate the sin, not the sinner.
Yeah.
And I think that is really important. That's one thing that has stayed with me from all the Catholicism.
And I think that connects strongly with some of the ideas that we've been trying to develop Paul's developed in CFT, and some of the things we've been trying to develop in forensic CFT, and that idea that we see a person, we don't just define them by the crimes or the offences that they've been convicted of, and we're curious about how they came to be capable of doing that. And there was a great book that was written in the 90s by a narrative therapist actually called Alan Jenkins, and it was about working with people with sexual convictions, and he called it Invitations to Responsibility.
Wow.
And it was that idea that, a bit like Gita Serenity, that you can't force people to face stuff.
No,
you can just try and create that space.
No, absolutely. I'd like to go on just the last. We haven't got that very much time. Yeah, let's go I'd like to just sort of get on to a section about. I'd like to just introduce this by reading a little bit. I'll just read a very, very short bit. This is the section called "How People in Organisations Can Kill." Listening some years ago to an interview with Dr. Gwen Adshead, a consultant forensic psychotherapist based at Broadmoor Hospital, I was struck by a phrase she used in relation to the 250 or so men she helped to treat in the unit, some of the most dangerous and disturbed patients in the country. She said they were like survivors of a disaster. Later in this same interview, she talked of how becoming a parent had made the work sadder for her because she began to see all these men as the small boys they were, how they might have been with all the promise that children have. And then, of course, the catastrophic nature of their lives after that. And Gwen Adshead was also incredibly influenced by Gita Serenity, and particularly by the book on Stangl. And what connects my work and that work is, I think, we both have a huge problem with the use of the word evil and the way that, especially the tabloid media, are happy to do that. It's extraordinarily lazy, that kind of that use of language. And the other issue, of course, is that Gwen Adshead's working with, particular people who've been condemned by our society. And yet the people the thousands and thousands of people I'm looking at are people who've never had the condemnation of society, who've killed from their desks, from their computers, from their words, memoranda, orders, that numerous people are killed. These people would argue that they may not have been an intent to kill. Yes, people died. Yes, it was extremely regrettable, but they were not responsible. Or rather, they were only responsible in as much as they were part of a system, a large organisation that was involved in war or politics. And then I talk about my shock at the way our society seemed to be obsessed about the labels of psychopath or sociopath. And yet, an individual psychopath, if free, and if there are certain factors to combine to trigger attacks, could kill 5 or 6 times in their life. A government or an oil company can carpet bomb cities, killing thousands, or wipe out the ecology of an entire region, and then do it again and again, seemingly with impunity.
And get paid for it.
And get paid for it. So I flag up these differences. I also bring in the work of Primo Levi and Hannah Arendt, who always were careful to talk about the staggering normality of the perpetrators. This is really, really critical. Primo Levi talked about the fact that these people are not the monsters we seem to sometimes think they are, and there's an extraordinary line here. This is Primo Levi writing after the war, and he talks about the trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were and still are terribly and terrifyingly normal. From the viewpoint of our legal institutions and of our moral standards of judgment, this normality was much more terrifying than all of the atrocities put together. And interestingly, Hannah Arendt's term that she's often used for, she's often misquoted about the banality of evil, she did not actually write that. The last word of her book on Eichmann is this terrifying, thought and word defying banality of evil. And yet it's always come into the English as banality of evil, which of course seems absurd and flippant. But anyway, so there's that. We then get on to, I came up with these 10 factors. This is through looking over 10 or 15 years. And we haven't got time to really go into, but these are 10 factors which you can find in many, many cases of people in organizations killing. And they're things like incrementalism, normalization, peer conformity, what you see accepted by those around you, dehumanization of language, the way the victims are abstractified, the way people distance themselves from the act of violence. Eichmann himself distanced himself. He was happy to have responsibility for the killing of millions in the Holocaust, but he was outraged when he was accused of killing with his own hands a Hungarian boy, which psychologically is incredibly complex. And then the other ones, we can. Some of those are going to be in the next book. I'm afraid this is only half. So anyway, we've only got a few minutes. I'm very aware of that horrible ticking clock. Can we go on to Speer and Casales?
Use that one, Dan. That says we've got 2 hours, 14 minutes.
Okay,
left.
all right.
That's the one I've been looking at.
Can we have this slide of? I mean, one thing there is hope in is the story of this man. Speer, after the war, quite rightly, was sentenced to 20 years. Many people thought he should have been executed, but that's a whole other discussion. He was sentenced to 20 years at Nuremberg. He arrived in the prison, and 3 months later, this man arrived. A staggering man, Pastor George Casales, a French theologian and priest, and he became the prison chaplain. And on the first day they meet, this is what happens. Casales, after the service, tells Speer that he holds him more responsible, more blameworthy than all of the other prisoners because he was the most intelligent. He had been responsible for extending a war in which millions had died, including many of Casales' own friends in the French resistance. Speer thanks him for his honesty and then tells him he has a question to ask, which, given his usual emotional reserve, seems quite exceptional. I'll be as honest in return. I've been sentenced to 20 years and I consider it just. I want to use this time that has been given to me. What I want to ask you is, would you help me become a different man? And in German he says, anderer Mensch, which has almost the meaning of rebirth. And Casales then thinks about it, and he takes Speer seriously, and he says, he agrees to help Speer. And over the next 3 years, they work together in a way that is perhaps difficult for us to understand. He later uses a strange and remarkable phrase to describe the process he encouraged Speer to go through. It had been a continuity of reflection, of studying, and of opening his mind and spirit to suffering. Opening his mind and spirit to suffering. And I think that is I think what Casales did with Speer in those 3 years is absolutely at the center of compassion. Compati, suffering with. And in those years, you see something which is astounding. John and I were talking about it earlier. So many of us in this room must have thought, can compassion be taught? And there are examples, and those give hope to the world, I think, these examples of, you see, if you read what Casales wrote afterwards and Speer's own words, staggering ways that this unbelievably compartmentalized, he becomes almost, like empathetic. Genuinely, there's empathy, there's concern. He starts reading novels. He starts opening himself up. He starts imagining other people's lives. It is absolutely remarkable. And then, of course, when he's released, total regression. He becomes a sort of global celebrity. All that good work that Casalis done in prison, it's all gone. And he becomes a sort of very narcissistic figure. But there is this 3-year period, and that's the 3 years that fascinates me, where Casalis was teaching Speer compassion and responsibility for what he'd done as well. And those things are remarkable. There's also a French philosopher and writer, Simone Weil, who is, I write about at the end of the book, and the centre of her life and work really was looking at compassion. Very, very complex ideas, very beautiful, and it's there in the book. But I think we've been beaten by the clock.
We have been beaten.
Run out of time.
I hadn't noticed before. It gets a more frantic flashing at you as it's approaching the end. I did think it was going to blow up or something at one point. But we need to finish, Dan. And I'm guessing, Matt, we haven't got any time for questions.
I'm not in charge, John, but I don't think so.
Neither am I. I mean, you'd be a fool to put me in charge of anything. I think we should probably stop so that we can keep the timing going for the day. There is one thing I want to say, Dan. I'm not going to make any comments about Leeds United. I promise I wouldn't do that, although they're cheats. But there's something, I said that what I found remarkable about your book was, I mean, some of the stuff you've just been talking about it's mind-blowing, isn't it, when you think about the folk we work with in secure environments and the condemnation they experience compared to lawyers and psychologists who are glorified despite the damage they cause to other people's lives. But it's the way you've entwined your life into the uncovering of these kind of atrocities. But there's a beautiful moment quite early in the book, and I think it's called A Journey Through Time, when you and Jay have been walking through Germany and are trying to make your way back to the UK. And at some point, you bury a tobacco tin, a Golden Virginia tobacco tin with 3 pebbles that you've got the platform logo on. And it, if I remember rightly, your intention was to go back and dig it up, and you couldn't do it because your blisters were too bad, so you had to get a train back to London in the end. Now, I couldn't find platform pebbles, but I did manage to get a Golden Virginia tin. So I hope that you can. Thank you for writing a book.
Is there anything inside it?
I'm not going to share what's inside that. No, there's nothing in there. There's nothing in there. I promise.
John. That's lovely.
Okay,
That's
we need to stop. Matt, thanks for introducing us.
Pleasure.
Dan, thank you for I, you, we, them. Can't wait for volume 2.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John. Thank you.